Without further ado, Lucas van Vyve.
Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Joey, as well. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second day of LangFest, and thank you for coming out so early to the first talks of the day. So I hope you had a great day yesterday already. I'm sure I did. I met some interesting people. It's my first time in Canada, too. Loving it so far. And yeah, today I'm going to do everything to make it worth your while waking up so early. So the topic of my talk today, the case against isolated words and grammar rules. How observing and chunking can save you from clumsiness and make fluent sentences a rule of the tongue. So this talk is for you if you've ever learned a language or tried to learn a language, which I assume most of you did, of course. If you ever used, traditional language, learning courses, maybe you learned language at school, you've been taking classes, used apps, or maybe books, in self-study to learn a language. You've learned a lot of memorized word lists and grammar rules, but still often during conversations at some point in your language learning journey, you felt stuck, you felt slow in speaking. Maybe you felt clumsy, you were guessing at the natural way of saying things. You often felt that you were translating in your head and you couldn't understand native speakers. Well, if that's the case, then, this talk is for you. So in this talk, I'm going to introduce you to a method that I use in my language courses that I teach, and also the one that I use myself, that can bring you to effortless conversations. And with effortless conversations, I mean, first of all, that you understand native speakers, of course, when they speak. And at the same time, they also have fluent sentences, just a roll of the tongue, which means no more embarrassment that you don't know what to say, no more clumsiness, just chatting away, and with the natives. And this is a bold promise, I know, but I'm confident to make it, because in this talk, I'm not going to talk that much about language learning tactics, memorization strategies, stuff like that. It's not about the tactics that much, more about a mindset shift. I want to instill a mindset shift in the way, you think about language learning. A mindset shift that started in the 1990s, that many linguists called revolutionary, but that for some reason is still very unknown to many language learners. And it all comes down to the difference between having a construction mindset while learning a language and an observation mindset. And before I explain exactly what I mean with that, let me just quickly introduce myself so you know where this is coming from. So I'm Lucas van Vyve. I'm from Belgium. I'm a translator, interpreter, a linguist, turned language entrepreneur. So I now help people learn languages. I run language courses. I run workshops. I'm the founder of the Polyglot Life. That's where I run workshops, online workshops on how to learn vocabulary, how to set up a solid language learning routine, etc. And the method I'm going to talk about today, I just finished writing a book about that as well. It will be published in the next couple of weeks. I'll talk a little bit more about that later in this talk. So, as I said before, the difference between a construction and observation mindset, this is, I think, the core thing that can make a big difference in your language learning. And construction mindset is, with that I mean, the traditional way of language learning that is often used in classes, in schools. And I believe that the construction mindset is really setting you up for failure. Because with this construction mindset, what you normally do, many people when they learn a language, maybe not all of you because you are more proficient probably in language learning than most language students in the world, but in traditional construction thinking, if you want to learn a language, you need two things. First of all, you need the raw ingredients for building sentences, which are the words, of course. So you learn a lot of words. You might learn thematic word lists, you might learn frequency lists, so the 600 or the 1000 most frequent words in a language, and these will be your raw material. Now, of course, you can't use them in sentences yet, so you need to learn grammar rules. So you start learning all the grammar rules to apply to the words and to string words together in sentences. Problem with that is that this is correct to some extent. You will be able to create some sentences if you do it this way, but you'll always be slow because you always have to think of the grammar rules. And even if you have a lot of practice, because that's what most people think, I just need more practice, I just need to speak more, and after a while I'll get faster at speaking. I'll do more, I'll think of the grammar rules faster. Fortunately, you almost never get to that point in my experience, and I'm sure many of you feel the same way. I know because I learned isolated words and grammar rules for a very long time at university. As I said before, I studied applied linguistics at university, also translation and interpretation. I had a lot of grammar classes, a lot of linguistics classes. For German, I knew all the rules. I knew all the declension tables, all the prepositions, which case to use after the prepositions. We had to learn a lot of, German words as well. We had exams we had learned thousands of words, just words. The Dutch on one hand, that was my mother tongue, and then just the German on the other hand. Just learn 5,000 words like that and have an exam. We did all that in 3 years. We knew it all. But then in our, in our fourth year, when I was studying interpretation, we were still clumsy. We still felt slow, unprepared for actual conversation, and we still felt that we were guessing, at a native-like way of saying things. And we not only felt that way, our teacher could also notice, of course. Our teacher at the time, our interpretation professor, was always looking at us like, what are you guys saying? I mean, it made sense to some extent, but it didn't sound good at all. And there was this one thing that he once said to me that really stuck with me, and that was like the trigger, for this mindset shift that I'm going to introduce you to right now. And that was that at a certain point he said, I translated something from Dutch into German, and he said, okay, Lucas, yes, Germans would understand you, but is that really how they would say themselves? Why are you trying to invent the language yourself? Why are you trying to create all these sentences and that nobody has ever said before? Why are you doing that? Why, people speak the language. People speak German every single day. The thing you want to say, probably a German native speaker has said it before already. So why don't you just, observe Germans in their conversations? Why don't you just listen to the way they combine words and expressions, how they create collocations, phrases, prepositions, how they express their anger, their surprise, how they react to each other in a conversation. Why don't you just do it that way and try to see how they do it? Then you'll know how to speak. You know how to speak in a natural way. And I mean, this might sound super obvious to you, and it did to me at the time as well, but at the same time, it was also, like a really big mindset shift and an eye-opener, because I never really thought of language learning that way. We're all way too focused on learning the words and the grammar rules and then trying to make grammatically correct sentences, whereas we don't really have to do that. We can observe. Just observe people and see what they say, and then you can start saying that yourself. And I decided to try doing that for a while. So I started observing, reading, listening much more. But I wasn't just listening, for, okay, I understand this. I really tried to see how they were using their language. And often when I did that, I started having these, I would even call it an epiphany, actually. I got super excited because I always thought, oh, okay, so that's how a native German speaker would say it. So I read something and I thought, okay, I understand this, but I would have never been able to say it myself that elegantly, that naturally, with my knowledge of words and grammar rules. I have some sort of clumsy equivalent based on words and grammar rules, probably translated from my mother tongue, but it's not the same as how a native speaker would say it. Now, the good thing, of course, is once you notice that, you can start using that yourself, right? So that's what I did. I started memorizing these things myself. And it was a really big relief because I really felt like, okay, I don't have to invent every single sentence. I don't have to think of the grammar all the time. I can see it there. I'm not guessing that much anymore while I'm speaking. Sentences started rolling off the tongue because I was much more confident in speaking. And I knew, okay, this is exactly how a native speaker said it because I just heard a native speaker say that. And I just felt more confident that I really spoke a language, not just some sort of construction, not a programming language. I wasn't working with words and grammar rules and trying to stick them together. I was speaking a language, something that people really use every single day. And this is, the basis of the language learning method that I now use in my language courses. And at the core of this method is a technique called chunking. You see, the secret to speak comfortably and fluently is, as you might have guessed, that you don't have words and grammar rules in your brain while speaking, especially not in your mother tongue, but also not in other languages you speak fluently. You have word combinations in your brain. And these word combinations, linguists call them chunks. They're word combinations with a very specific meaning that are always, or at least very often, used together, that you've heard so often, not that you've used so often, but that you've heard so often, that you don't even think about them as separate words anymore. And you don't have to know the grammar behind them. You can start using these chunks from the very beginning. But when you want to use them, they just roll off the tongue because you're not thinking about grammar, you just speak. And these chunks exist in all languages, of course, also in your mother tongue. So if your mother tongue is English, you say things like, how's it going? You can call in election, you say, by the way. Someone is struck by lightning, for example. You book a table. All these things that just roll off the tongue, you don't think about them as separate anymore. And to show you also that it's not only about grammar, it's not about forming grammatically correct word chunks. Here's an example. Merry Christmas. That sounds probably correct to most of you native speakers, right? Happy Christmas as well, depending maybe on where you're from. Might sound a little bit weird, but generally this is accepted. You can also say happy birthday. But can you say merry birthday? Sounds really weird, right? And still, I mean, it's grammatically correct, right? There's nothing wrong with using an adjective and a noun together, and especially merry, even content-wise, it makes sense. Merry, just happy, merry birthday. Why not? Well, because it's not a chunk. People don't use it, people don't say it. So you as a native, as a language learner, shouldn't say it either. You don't have to create new things. The job you have as a language learner is to communicate effectively. You don't need to create new sentences. You're not a poet, you're not a novelist yet in target language, of course. So for now, your goal should be to find these things, to say Merry Christmas, Happy Birthday, not Merry Birthday. Other languages this exists, of course, as well. Chunking is why native speakers in German don't have to think about like which cases they're using. They don't have to think about word endings. They probably don't even know the declension tables. If you ask a native speaker, why are you using a dative here? They don't know. Like in this sentence, erzähl mal, gibt es bei dir etwas Neues? Bei dir. Why is it with a dative? They don't know. They don't care. They speak. It's a chunk in their brain. And if you ever want to speak fluently in German as well, this is the point where you need to get at. And I'll show you later how to do that, of course. Same for Spanish, French, Italian. They don't know when to use a subjunctive. They don't know about like, okay, necessity or volition, je veux que. They don't know. They just use it automatically because they know after il faut que, they've heard it so many times, and then they started saying it as well, that it just rolls off the tongue. And if you don't use it, it sounds wrong to them, right? Same with verb endings. They don't know conjugation tables, they just speak. All these are chunks. It's all chunks that you have in your brain. And if you want to speak a language fluently and if sentences roll off the tongue, this is what you need as well. So what does that mean for you? Well, you have two choices. You could, first of all, start with the construction mindset I said before. So you can learn isolated words and grammar rules and struggle for a very long time until you get so much exposure that your brain stops thinking about the words and the grammar rules and starts combining these chunks automatically, subconsciously. Now, unfortunately, you need an awful lot of exposure for that to happen. As a child, you did that, but you had like 10 years probably of exposure before you really got like all these chunks ingrained in your brain. Now, luckily, we are all adult language learners, so we know that we can use strategies and tactics to speed up this process and to learn a language much faster. So you can skip that painful step. Don't worry that much about isolated words and grammar rules and become what I call a keen observer of your target language. And notice and memorize these chunks from the very beginning. And if you do that, the result will be fluent sentences rolling off the tongue from the very beginning and a lot less worry about grammar. Of course, I'm not promising that you can speak fluently from the very beginning on all topics, but at least on the topics where you got a lot of exposure, where you listen to a lot, it will become much easier to speak, much, much easier. Now, I hope you're a bit excited about this concept of chunking. When I discovered it, I was very, very excited. I didn't know it at the time, of course, when my professor talked about this, that it was called chunking. But later, I started doing some research on that. Yeah, there is quite some research on the concept of chunking. And the concept is based on the lexical approach, which is an approach to language teaching, popularized in the 1990s, as I said before, by Michael Lewis. Michael Lewis has written some excellent books on this topic. This is one of his most famous ones, Implementing the Lexical Approach. And in this book, he talks a lot about there's this classical divide between grammar and vocabulary, that it actually doesn't really exist in your brain. That you actually have, these word combinations, which are a combination of words and grammar in some way in your brain, and that's the key to speaking fluently and also to teaching, And there's more research on that as well. Wilkins, for example, in his book, Linguistics in Language Teaching, said if you learn word combinations, patterns, and chunks instead of isolated words and grammar rules, you can cover in half the time what's expected from a whole year of language learning. Now, of course, it's up for debate what a whole year of language learning consists of and how many hours you study, of course. But my own experience and the experience of my students in my language courses we use this confirm this. It's much easier, much faster, and it just gives you much less overwhelm, if you don't have to think about the grammar rules all the time. Now, the problem with the lexical approach and with all this, this linguistic research that I found is that it was very much focused on how teachers should use this knowledge, to teach languages, which exercises they should give their students so they would find the chunks. How can they draw attention to the chunks, like how the attention of the students to their chunks, to these chunks. But there was not that much focus on how language learners like you and I should use this, to learn a language, how we should do this. And I believe that the real power of this mindset of chunking really comes from this mindset shift, It's in adopting the mindset of looking for chunks all the time, not just listening and trying to understand, but really trying to see how are native speakers combining words in sentences and moving away from this words and grammar paradigm. That makes a big difference. And and that's not really that much like focused upon in these there's a fly. Not that much focus on in these linguistic research papers. So that's why I decided to do it myself. I tried to bring it together in a language learning method that people could use, to get to effortless conversations, called the effortless conversations method. Again, for effortless conversations, first of all, you need to understand what your conversation partner says, of course. And then you also need to be able to speak yourself, express yourself freely without having to think about grammar rules all the time, so you can really focus on the message. Have sentences or chunks roll off the tongue. And in this method, in this strategy, there are 5 steps. First of all, getting a lot of input. Second, practicing listening comprehension. Third step, identifying and noticing the chunks. Fourth step, imprinting the chunks on your brain, so memorizing them. And then the 5th step, of course, speaking yourself, implementing. So I thought we could just go through these steps a little bit, and I'll give you some more examples of chunks as well, and show you exactly how I do this myself and how we do this in my language courses. So first step, input. And if you accept this theory that you have chunks in your brain, well, this is a logical step, right? If you need to find chunks, like how native speakers speak, well, logical consequence of that is that you need to listen a lot and read a lot. You need to find these chunks somewhere. You won't find them by speaking yourself. Because if you speak yourself on a topic that you don't know the chunks about yet, you'll go back to your construction mindset. You'll start, being clumsy again and thinking and translating in your head and trying to construct sentences which you don't know are actual, natural sounding sentences. So you need a lot of input. You need to listen a lot to native speakers. You need to read a lot. Now, especially, of course, for if you're practicing for conversations, makes sense that you would listen a lot to people speaking. You would observe how people speak, not write, because there's a very big difference, of course, between that. Conversational language is not always grammatically correct. There's a lot of slang. There are idioms that are only used in conversation. It's real interaction. And that's very different from reading something like a newspaper, for example. That can be useful too, but it's not going to bring you that much if you really want to, become better at speaking, at least in my opinion. Now, of course, if you get a lot of input, then you'll improve your listening comprehension automatically already. The more input you get, the better you become at understanding native speakers. And, listening comprehension is a very big problem for many language learners. I, for one, think that speaking another language is difficult, but not that difficult. Listening, understanding native speakers, much more difficult. And if you don't understand, what the other person says, you can't have a conversation, of course. So the problem I see with many language courses and the way people approach listening comprehension is that, first of all, people just don't listen enough. You need to listen a lot, like I said before. This will hopefully be fixed if you get a lot of input. But also that most people don't listen enough at fast speed or at native-like speed. Because many language courses come with super clear dialogues or recorded by voice artists. Nobody speaks that way. It's just, you won't understand anything. Or it's slowed down, especially in beginner course. It's super slow. If you're taking classes, your teacher will probably speak simplified, and also much slower. If you listen to your fellow students, they make a lot of mistakes too. They will speak slowly as well. So you don't get that much exposure to real native-like audio with real native speed. And of course, it's difficult in the beginning to start out with listening to native speakers super fast. You can listen to simplified language. I still believe it should be fast, though. So even if you have shorter sentences, for example, in beginner dialogues, they should still be spoken, I think, at native-like speed. And the one tool that can make this a lot easier, and I think it's the best tool out there for language learning, is transcripts. If you have the audio and you have a transcript as well, and you can read along on the transcript, then even if it's super fast, you will still understand, right? Because you can just read. And maybe you don't understand all the words, but it doesn't matter that much, because if you listen a lot and then you listen without the transcript and you read along with the transcript and you start listening without the transcript again, after a while it will all start to click. And this really happens. It might sound difficult in the beginning, you might not understand a word in the beginning, but if you keep listening and you use a transcript, you will get to that point very fast where you understand much, much more. And transcript, I said before, is my favorite tool for language learning, not only because it helps you with listening comprehension, also because it makes it so much easier to identify chunks. And I said this before, what are you looking for chunks? Well, patterns, word combinations, adjective, noun combinations. Doesn't really matter which combination. It's not an exact science, but everything where you think, okay, I understand this phrase, this sentence, but I would never have been able to use this construction myself. And just looking out for these things makes a big difference, just adopting this mindset, like I said before. So again, some examples, we already covered these before. In English, call an election, I hope so, happy birthday, Merry Christmas, a golden opportunity, using tag questions as well, don't you? wouldn't you? All these things. It's all a chunk. In German, die Wohnung war überhaupt nicht teuer. This is a chunk. This is something that sounds very, very native-like if you say this. Überhaupt nicht teuer. So if you learn that by heart, if you learn the whole thing, überhaupt nicht teuer, then you can just say it, even from the very beginning, if you don't even know like what überhaupt or like what that means. Dat Essen ist schon auf dem Tisch. Auf dem Tisch. You don't have to know if you just learn this by heart, you know, like it's the food is on the table. Then you don't have to know that like this is what is it actually? This is like a situation. It's not a movement, right? So it has to be with a dative. We haben vor 2 Jahren ein Apartment gekauft. Vor 2 Jahren again, 2 years ago. If you know in English 2 years ago, and you just learn this as a chunk, vor 2 Jahren, then you don't have to think about it anymore. You'll just roll off the tongue. In Urlaub fahren is another one. Go on holiday. Auf jeden Fall. This is a very popular chunk, I think. This is just rolls of the tongue for all native speakers. Auf jeden Fall, not auf jedem Fall or auf jeder Fall. If you say that, if you learn with chunks, you will notice that this sounds wrong, and you won't do it wrong anymore because you just learned this whole thing as a full chunk. Same in French. J'ai beaucoup travaillé ces derniers temps. Lately, ces derniers temps. Il y a toujours trop de monde en été. En été. Is it a été, au été? Sounds super weird to me because I've got a lot of exposure for French already. But in the beginning, you don't know unless you learn en été as a chunk. Trop de monde is another one. Bon, en tout cas, voilà une bonne chose de faite. Would you ever know how to say une bonne chose de faite if you didn't see it somewhere? You know, you can't like just create that sentence out of thin air. You just can't do it. You need to observe first. And once you see that, une bonne chose de faite sounds very, 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 very natural, you know? And I actually found this chunk a couple of weeks ago. So the tutor for my language course has created like a couple of dialogues, and she used this a couple of times. And I was like, oh, I've never heard this before, but now I've seen this. Une bonne chose de faite sounds good. Doesn't sound like I'm like translating in my head. So I'm going to learn this, and I'm going to start saying this myself. It means like, in any case, well, another good thing done. So another thing that we finished, you know. And see, you don't even know what it means, and it's maybe something you wouldn't say in your mother tongue. It's not something, oh, another thing done. You wouldn't say that in English, but people say it in French apparently, and you know what it means, so you can start saying this right now. Spanish wife here, pero parece que es una persona un poco seria, una persona un poco seria. Me gusta mucho, probably a very, very famous chunk. Everyone knows that one. A veces, sometimes, visito a mi abuela. The fact that you need to use this there's no rule for that either. You just see it as a chunk, so I just learned this as a chunk, and then you won't do it wrong anymore. You know, if you learn this full phrase by heart. Por la noche is another one, at night. So you can't say anoche or la noche in Spanish, you say por la noche. So the whole thing you need to learn as a chunk. It doesn't make sense to learn these words separately. Finally, Italian, ti aspetto qui sotto. I'm waiting for you downstairs. Qui sotto. It's just here, down. That's what it is. You don't know that until you see it somewhere. La macchina è parcheggiata a 2 passi. A 2 passi means nearby, close by. But they don't say, so normally they would say maybe vicino. Vicino is close by. But they say a 2 passi, and they really say that all the time when I was living in Italy. So yeah, why wouldn't you start saying that, right? Instead of saying vicino, which is much more like translated from your mother tongue. Andare al mare, just going to the seaside. Secondo me domani sarà bel tempo. Sarà bel tempo, not sarà un bel tempo or il tempo sarà bellissimo. This is how I observed it, and even if the other things could be correct as well, this is how I saw native speakers, what native speakers said. So that's what I'm going to use myself as well. Yeah, so as I said before, identifying chunks is personal, of course. Some of these things that you saw here or that you hear might not stand out to you that much because you've already, you already have them in your brain maybe. Maybe you got so much exposure, you're like, yeah, okay, I know that already. I don't need to think of that as a chunk anymore. Whereas others of these chunks, you would think, okay, I've never heard that before. I now know what it means, so I can start using it myself as well. But this is personal, different for everyone. We all have different exposure to our target language. Yeah, and like I said, it's just a matter of practice, training this mindset. And that's the big difference. It's not like about an exact science, it's about training the mindset of looking out for how are native speakers saying things, how are they saying things in a more natural, native-like way than I do myself. And when you practice that mindset, you can really get to that point where you see chunks everywhere. And many of my students say that, like they're like, okay, I'm going to try like finding some chunks in this dialogue. And then after a while, they just listen and read, and they're like, oh, chunks everywhere, which is good, right? Because then you know that you're actually like learning. If you don't, so some tools that can help you with identifying chunks. First of all, a parallel translation can be very useful. Like we did before, there's an example from one of my courses, from one of the dialogues. Can you read that? Is it too small, or can you read it? So the first sentence is, au lieu de ne rien faire, Lise, tu ferais mieux de t'activer un peu. Instead of doing nothing, Lisa, you could better get a move on. Yeah? Au lieu de, instead of, you can just compare this directly and you see, okay, this is how we say it in English. Oh, so this whole thing is how you say it in French. This is the phrase. Ne rien faire, doing nothing. The fact that you have to add ne, this is something that many people forget. They would say rien faire. It's actually ne rien faire. So these things can help. If you have a parallel translation, that makes things easier. If you don't have a parallel translation, you can use the dictionary, of course. Just look it up. Especially collocation dictionaries or a website like context.reverso. It's really useful because you can just add the chunk there and just, and it'll give you a lot of different sentences where the chunk is used, different contexts, so you'll get even better at like recognizing the chunk. Or you can use tools like Readline, which is a Chrome extension, or Link. Steve is sitting here. You know probably that this is perfectly possible with Link. You can add different word combinations. So that's a perfect tool for that as well. Now, and there's a difference maybe with what Steve normally does. Some people think, like, if you get a lot of exposure, a lot of inputs, and you notice these chunks, you will like automatically absorb them and you'll be able to use them. And this is true to some extent. Just the feeling of excitement of like, okay, I found something that I can start saying myself, that often helps already, like, and you can probably speak already with that, especially if you get a lot of exposure. But I believe that for very relevant chunks that you really want to be using, especially in the beginning, when you start out with a language, it can be very useful to make an active effort to imprint these chunks on your brain, to memorize them. So they're readily available to you when you want to use them during conversations. And yeah, to do that, honestly, it's not that different from learning isolated words. You can use mnemonics, spaced repetition, flashcards, gold list method if you're familiar with that, memory palaces. You can use exactly the same tools that you use for learning isolated words, and you can use them for learning chunks as well. I like using Anki, so spaced repetition, for learning chunks. And what I normally do is I would add a full sentence where I found a chunk or where I heard a chunk. I would add that on a flashcard. And then I would blank out the chunk and add the translation in my mother tongue. So for example, if I wanted to learn this chunk, ich möchte gerne book a table. So now I have to give the chunk in English. Do you know what it is? It's an easy one. Ein Tisch reservieren, exactly. Yeah, so this is how I would do it normally. The benefit of that is, first of all, you see the chunk in context. There's more hooks as well for your brain. Plus, you see the thing, like, even if you only learn like the chunk ein Tisch reservieren, if you use flashcards and you see them often, after a while, you'll know the whole sentence. And you'll have like the whole sentence in your brain. Ich möchte gerne einen Tisch reservieren. It just comes automatically after a while.
You make it bidirectional in one way?
I make them one way. So I just have the full sentence in German normally, and then I only blank out the chunk. I don't do them in the other direction. I just only do them this way. Yeah, so that's basically what I use here. You can add audio as well, of course. You can add some other things. You can still use mnemonics and imagery with this as well. What I like here is also that you don't lose the connection, with the language, because I still remember. Okay, not with this one maybe, but. I often still remember like where I found the chunk. I see the full sentence like, oh yeah, I found this chunk when I was listening to this podcast or when I was reading my SML lesson or something like that. And you have the whole story in your brain. And it just makes it much easier. You keep the connection with the language. You still feel like you're really learning a language instead of learning like 1,000 or 2,000 words. So that's why I prefer doing it this way. Yeah, and then finally, of course, if you've done all this, make all this effort to listen a lot, identify chunks, practice your listening comprehension, memorize the chunks, you need to start using them yourself, of course, as well. And if you do it right, they will really roll off the tongue. It will really happen. It's not just something that I say here like a marketing player. So it's really, it happens. I learned Italian completely this way, from scratch. I didn't know any Italian. I went to Italy. I used ASML for this. I just learned chunks. I used flashcards. I spoke a lot with friends of mine. And, from the very beginning, not on all topics, of course, but I could really speak fluently, easily. I wasn't, like, guessing that much. I felt confident. And people notice as well, like, that when you speak, not just like a language learner who's making up sentences, that you really speak like they speak. And they appreciate it, of course. So, but this is important, of course. You can't become better at speaking if you don't speak. So you still need some practice for that, pronunciation practice as well, of course. Yeah, but this is the main strategy that we use. So 5 steps. Where were they again? Let's see if I can come back. Input, listening, comprehension, identify chunks, imprint chunks, and implement. If you do this from the very beginning when you're learning a language, or also when you're already at a higher level, you can do this perfectly like if you're intermediate level already. Because I didn't know this when I was learning German, of course. I learned German the other way. I started doing this, listening, reading a lot, even going back to like Asumil beginner books, finding these chunks, and I found so many chunks that I never even noticed, although I knew all the words. So I went back, I refined I call that refining your knowledge, you know? You know the words already, you feel like you can make yourself understood, but you don't really, you know, speak naturally, fluently, you don't feel comfortable like a native. If you start learning chunks and you start noticing them, that will make a big difference. One question I sometimes get is, how does grammar fit in the whole story? And yeah, because of course, I mean, you need some grammar instruction, right? And I agree, grammar can help you in understanding the structure of a language. A lot, actually. But it doesn't make you speak fluently. You will never speak fluently if you have to think of the grammar rules. So that's why I believe that if you want to learn grammar in chunks. Or better even, first learn the chunks, so you're already using the right grammar patterns, and then get a grammar explanation. And then it'll be like, oh, okay, so this is why I'm saying by dear. Because after this preposition, I need to use that. And then you can extrapolate. But this is the way I think it should be. So you first start using it, you first start seeing it, and then you get the explanation. And then, yeah, it just becomes much easier. You won't forget it anymore. You can also do this with flashcards, like I said before. For example, if you want to learn that after il faut que you need to use a subjunctive. You can just make one flashcard or a couple of flashcards where you use il faut que, and then you blank out vous utilisiez, and you say le subjunctif. This is a very simplified example, of course. We can make a couple of these. And then after a while, because you see this so often, you will start saying it automatically. Il faut que vous utilisiez le subjunctif. This is utilisiez, if you don't speak French. This is a subjunctive. Yeah, and that way it's just much easier. And you won't forget it anymore, and you don't have to know the rule anymore. You will just have like imprinted that chunk with il faut que, that there's a subjunctive following on that. Okay, and that's basically the full strategy that we use in my language courses, that I use myself, that I hope some of you will start using as well now. There's one more pillar in that method. First pillar was using the power of observation and chunking, so getting that mindset instead of learning isolated words and grammar rules. Second step, then apply that full strategy that we just talked about, the 5 steps, to conversational learning materials. So listen a lot to conversations. Reading will help you as well, but a novel won't help you that much in conversations. You need conversational language, dialogues, podcasts, interviews, stuff like that. And then finally, of course, create a solid, easy to follow routine that sets you up for lifelong language learning success. Yeah, because of course, if you don't follow through, if you don't stick to it for at least a couple of months, or probably much more than that, probably a year or more than a year, you can have the best strategies in the world, you will still not get anywhere. And I'm sure many of you know that. Many people start learning a language, then after a couple of weeks you lose motivation and you stop. Well, then even if you learn with chunks, yes, you might be able to say some sentences, but I mean, you're not going to get really fluent. You won't get to effortless conversations. It takes a while. And that's like with every method, but also with this method, because you need so much exposure to notice all these chunks and to imprint them on your brain. Now, the way I try to get all that exposure, and I teach people in my language courses to get enough exposure while not overwhelming themselves, while not like making them study for hours a day, is that I tell them to divide their language learning time in focus study time, so focus study sessions, and exposure time. So first of all, I tell them you need to integrate the language in your day, but in a casual way. So not studying, just listen to music every day, for example. Listen to podcasts. Replace some of the activities you do in your mother tongue with activities in your target language. In the morning, you might listen to a podcast and you commute, change it to a podcast in your target language. You might change your alarm in the morning to something in another language. There are many things you can do. You can add things on your Facebook newsfeed, follow news websites on your Facebook newsfeed in your target language, stuff like that. So get a lot of that exposure, but don't study. So you can still try to notice chunks, but I mean, don't make like an active effort to memorize everything, because if you do that, then you'll feel like you're studying all day and you'll burn out. Now, on top of that, I tell them to do short focus study sessions, daily or a couple of times a week, Sessions of not longer than 10, 15, 20 minutes maybe. And this is where you would really like sit down, go deep, do some real studying, for example, with a course or with a dialogue that you found somewhere. Find chunks, indicated chunks maybe, make flashcards out of them, maybe do some flashcard sessions, review sessions. And this is where you really like feel like you're learning the language. You could also do some pronunciation practice there, all these things. But yeah, not like hours a day, because most people just can't do that. They will burn out after a couple of weeks. So if you do these short sessions and you add to that a lot of fun exposure time, because it's going to be fun, like this exposure, listening to the radio or music or watching shows, TV series, that's fun. And if you add to that like some focus studying, I found that to be the perfect recipe to really stick to it in the long term and make some solid progress as well. Yeah, I have some more case studies here. I don't know what time it is. I don't think we have that much time for it anymore. We still got time? Until when do we have? 20 minutes here, right? Do we have 20 minutes? Okay. Yeah, anyway, do you have any questions right now, maybe, before we get started with this case study? Do we need the mic for that or not?
Hello.
Hey.
First of all, chunking is much more fun to say than studying, so I think I'm going to say let's go chunking instead of let's go studying from now on. As for my question, you referenced when you're chunking, you can listen to really fast material while reading along with it.
Yeah.
For languages which have a different script and they might not necessarily have an alphabet like Chinese, what would you recommend those studiers or chunkers do?
Chunkers, I like that. I'm going to introduce that, chunkers. Yeah, I don't have that much experience with languages with a different script. I played around with Russian a little bit, but that's very close, of course, to like the Roman script. It's going to be difficult, of course. I think you need, then what I would do is I would spend a lot of time on learning the script first, if there is a script, of course, like you say. If not, it's just going to be much more difficult. Maybe, do you have feedback or have a question?
I think the question you have to ask yourself is, are you learning Chinese to read a Chinese newspaper, or are you learning to talk Chinese?
Exactly.
What's your main objective? Because if you want to read, awesome, let me get this. If I learn Chinese, I want to be illiterate. That's my goal. Because how much of the Chinese population can actually write? It's a lot. But they speak fine. So remember that you don't actually need letters to speak. And a lot of times, letters will hurt your accent, make it much more difficult to pronounce the language because you have all your other languages baggage that you bring, like the R sounds from your respective languages.
Absolutely.
Remember that if you hear it first and don't see letters, that can actually really help your accent and your understanding. Because no one's ever speaking with subtitles, right?
I totally agree. So, of course, this method is very much focused on like conversational language, right? So you want to become better at conversations, not reading that much. You can do this with reading as well, because of course there are chunks in reading as well, but they're very different, like I said before, from listening, from speaking. And yeah, like you said in the beginning, if you would practice your pronunciation, I wouldn't like read along on a transcript. That's going to hurt your pronunciation for sure. If you want to identify chunks, transcript is going to be very useful, but you don't have to have one, you know. Steve?
Just a quick comment. First of all, I am a reader, so I would recommend learning to read any language you're going to learn. But insofar as Chinese, my observation on chunking, first of all, I agree with most of what you said, but the chunking it becomes more difficult when the language is more grammatical, like Slavic languages. Chinese is dead easy insofar as chunking is concerned because there's no grammar there. So you're just picking up, we say it this way in English, they say it that way in Chinese.
Yeah.
It's pretty straightforward. But in Russian, to try to remember the cases, and I've tried hard tagging phrases with genitive and blah, 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 and eventually certain cases start to show up in your brain. But it's a lot tougher when the grammar is complicated.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, language with very different grammar. That makes it more difficult. What I would do in these cases, and what I try to do as well, is indeed just learn the phrase, and even if I don't know the grammar rules, just see, okay, what I want to say here, how does a native speaker say that? Just learn that by heart. No, they don't know it. And of course, even in French, for example, if you do this with French, you'll notice because they speak very, you know, bombastic, right? They use a lot of words to say things that are like 2 words in English. It becomes more difficult because as I said before, you can't like directly find like the chunk in English and in Dutch, like in bonjour de fête, for example. We don't have that. in English, or at least I think so. It's not my mother tongue, but yeah. So that just makes it more difficult. But you can still do it, of course, and it's more fun, I think, as well, because it shows that you speak more naturally like a native speaker, because you're actually not translating in your head anymore, not even like trying to look for the parallel anymore. You're just looking for things like, okay, so this is how a French speaker says it. I would never say that in English, and I would never say an equivalent in English, but people do it, so I'm going to do it as well.
So I guess I want to get your feeling about chunking and at the raw beginner stage versus further on. So I used Anki quite a bit at the intermediate stage in Spanish, and even before that a bit. But I did chunking, and I totally get the value. It seems to me that when you're a raw beginner, like I'm a big fan of the raw beginner stage going through something like a Pimsleur, which effectively seems to me like it's just pre-made chunks of conversation that you completely bake into your brain, and it's a lot lower effort to use something like that at the raw beginner stage than to try to make your own content. What do you think about that?
I agree. In the beginning, and I would even, so I do this from the very beginning, but I'm not against learning like 500 or 600 words in the beginning, even isolated words, although I think it's very difficult to memorize them, but I sometimes do it just because then you get like a comprehension head start, you know? So then it becomes easier to find these chunks because you know some words already. So in the very, very beginning, that's something I recommend. Pimsleur, of course, if they already give you the phrases and the chunks and they use them in sentences, much easier. But a book like Assimil, I think, is perfect for learning chunks because they start with quite easy sentences, but they still use conversations, so it's still pretty, pretty natural. Yeah, and you can find the chunks in there automatically, even if, and they show you the things that you don't know yet, even like grammatical things that you don't know yet, and they only explain them after seven lessons, right? So, yeah, I think the method works extremely well if you've been learning language with traditional like methods, isolated words, grammar rules, and you're at that intermediate stage already. If you want to like break through that intermediate plateau, learning chunks will really make you much more natural. At the beginning stages, it's more difficult, but you can still do it, and yeah, it will just make it easier to speak from the very beginning as well. Any more questions? Yeah.
So at the beginning, you talked about making that error like Merry Birthday, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, how does this approach help you prevent making that mistake? Because for instance, in an extemporaneous conversation, if I'm talking to someone and they say, hey, today's my birthday, right? But I've never learned how to say happy birthday in the language, I still might say, right, Merry Birthday out because I haven't come across the chunk before. So I guess my question is, how do you really prevent yourself from making those errors, or do you have a recommendation for how to apply this method in terms of what phrases you learn first? Because I just know, you're not going to ever be able to learn every chunk.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes using that approach, you could end up in a conversation and go, oh, I don't know how a native speaker would say it, right? So you're still going to be forced to make up some of those constructed sentences sometimes, right?
It's going to happen. I've never heard anyone say Merry Birthday, but it might happen, absolutely. And in other languages, you probably said stuff like that already, like that you don't even know. And some people, they don't, I mean, they know it's weird, but they don't like call you out on it, You can't prevent that, of course, because you can't like listen. I mean, you need so much exposure to learn all these chunks, and you will get like comfortable to a point where you can talk about a lot of topics that you usually talk about without having too many of these instances. But of course, you will end up in a conversation where you don't know the chunks, and then you will have to just like make do with what you know, and you will say stuff like that. And then I like it when people call me out on it. When I say Merry Birthday, for example, and people say, oh, that sounds really weird. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to use it anymore. What do you say instead? And they would say, okay, say Happy Birthday. So, but you don't never know, because some people, like I said, don't call you out on it. You can't prevent that. So that's why it's still useful, of course, to know some grammar rules. And if you know more words, you will still be able, to make yourself understood. But if you're after fluent sentences, very natural, like speech, if that's your goal, then yeah, just try to listen and read as much as possible, and you'll get better.
So I have a question about verb conjugation.
Yeah.
So you talked about the example of, il faut que je fasse attention, or whatever it is when using the subjunctive in French. So I just happen to be learning the subjunctive in French right now. And so, okay, I know the real basics, like il faut que je fasse, il faut que je prenne. But now I feel like I have to pull out a verb conjugation chart because I don't know the subjunctive for all the rest of the verbs. So would you instead make a sentence for every imaginable verb? Would you just do the irregulars and a few regulars? How would you approach that with chunks?
I think if you want to like learn this fast, yeah, then conjugations, for example, for irregular verbs, learning, I would make like probably a sentence for everyone, yeah. I would like try to make, and not like not for every verb, like all persons, huh? But I would still, yeah, try to make sentences out of these. And after a while, I mean, it doesn't take that long. Il faut que, after a while, you know that you need to use that, so you don't need like that many like flashcards for that. But yeah, for the exceptions, irregular verbs, I would do that probably.
Hello.
Hey.
Thank you for the talk. As a French teacher in a public high school,
okay.
I'm happy to be in a team, a close-knit team of language instructors who are doing research with comprehensible input and who are, you know, we don't use textbooks or do worksheets or anything like that.
Very good.
So it's really about having fun and creating with the language. But just a site that I could recommend to you is called Cool Conjugator, and it does provide all the conjugations, but in context. So if you're looking for examples of the subjunctive, go to that website, and then you'll see like phrases with the subjunctive, and that's a way that you could chunk that up. But your talk also made me think of like the net hypothesis. I don't know if you read about that.
The net hypothesis?
Yeah, Krashen and Terrell in 1983. So when somebody talks to you in a language that you have not completely acquired so that you understand what is said, the speaker casts a net of structure around your current level of competence. I was just thinking about that and what you said about, you know, not necessarily being sure about what to say, and which led me to think that, you know, anytime you're saying something in a new language, it's always kind of a hypothesis anyway. So
absolutely.
So you're just testing the waters,
yeah.
And you know, based on how much you've been exposed to a certain structure, you can either be pretty sure about it or pretty unsure. But I think embracing the hypothesisness of it is a good.
It's always going to be there when you learn a language. It's true. You can eliminate most of it by learning chunks. Not all of it, especially in the beginning. You can't, because you don't have that much exposure yet, as you just said. But yeah, the hypothesis is always there. Yeah.
Oh. Yeah, another thing that's really helpful for me is to think about it in terms of pattern recognition. You don't have to learn every conjugation of every irregular verb for every person because they're all the same, and obviously there are exceptions, but often exceptions will also be subsets of sub-patterns. So if you can learn, like in Portuguese, I went to a Portuguese course at college and they tried to teach me like, o pretérito perfeito da terceira pessoa no futuro subjuntivo, and I was like, what are you talking about? There's so many grammar terms. All they meant was like, if I go, if you have time, like, if you want. And those are the three cases of this like super scary future subjunctive, they call it. But basically it's just the infinitive of any verb, if you want, if you have, if you can.
No.
Like something that's not yet happened with an if or a when or a like. And all those words actually just kind of terrified us, and we're like, oh, it's so hard. We'll never be able to win that. But if you just learn chunks like you're recommending, it just means if you are, if you want, if you go. And that's it.
Yeah.
You don't need to know what it's called. You don't need to have a chart. You don't need to learn the table. You don't need to consciously be aware of any of this.
Exactly.
If you just learn the chunk, see your foot, see this, see this.
Absolutely.
Really.
And you can extrapolate, of course, as well. You know, when you do this, you get to a point where you know what's natural, and if you've learned a language up to like a pretty high level, like high, intermediate, advanced, in some of these languages, I just know that I say something that sounds wrong. Like a couple of times during this presentation, I said something in English, but I thought, okay, this sentence is wrong. I know. And yeah, it's like the feeling for the language that you just develop. And if you learn a lot of chunks, and if you get a lot of exposure and input after a while, even things that you feel like you've never heard before, you will still know if it's wrong or not, because you just became so good at pattern recognition. You have so many patterns in your brain that you know, like, this pattern is probably not exactly correct. Not always, though, because before I saw something in one of the dialogues one of my teachers made, j'ai beau essayer. I well tried, or something like that. And you even write it with essayer, like infinitive. And I looked it up and I was like, this is wrong. No, it's correct. J'ai beau essayer. I didn't know that was right, but now I know it's right, so I'm going to start using it as well, you know. But often, what?
It doesn't mean like I'd better try.
No, j'ai beau essayer means I try, yeah, native speakers. I tried as much as I can, but it didn't work, something like that. Yeah, but usually you get very good at like getting a feeling for the language, and then you will probably, like in the beginning, know, but after a while you will know that Merry Birthday isn't correct, even if you've never like really consciously like thought about it, you know. Let's see. Yeah.
When I talk to him, he says any deliberate studying is a waste of time. You just learn through whatever, learning and
Yeah.
But the fact is that any deliberate effort to, say, learn chunks and stuff like that is a very constructive engagement with the language.
Absolutely.
So whether in fact you're going to learn those chunks that you're trying to learn, or whether in fact you learn like these other chunks that you never even paid attention to, almost doesn't matter.
Absolutely.
If you like doing it, you're engaging with the
Yeah.
language. It's going to be effective. Whether you learn the ones that you target, or you never learn the ones you're trying to learn, and you learn some other ones, it really doesn't matter. It's still a very positive thing to do.
Absolutely. I believe some active effort to learn chunks can be useful, like Steve says. I don't believe that just reading and listening, I mean, it will work, reading and listening, and then, but it takes so much longer. Why wouldn't you take advantage of like something like flashcards or something like imagery and like using mnemonics? It's all there and we know it works. So why wouldn't you use it to learn some of these chunks faster so you can learn a language faster, right?
Hi, so one of the most difficult things for me to learn in the languages that I'm learning is the proper use of prepositions a lot of times, because you can learn a phrase that uses a few different prepositions in a few different ways, and there's a lot of times very subtle nuances that are apparent to native speakers, but to me, when I come across these phrases, I don't always catch the little differences, the nuances in meaning. And sometimes it's very big differences, like they say it's better to be pissed off than to be pissed on, right? But, and, you know, and for anyone who has a grasp of English, that, you know, the difference is quite obvious. So, for, am I going out? Do you have any recommendations for like how to notice the subtle nuances that might not be as obvious when you're not a native speaker?
Parallel transcripts. Wait, I'll try. Does this computer have internet? I'll try to give you an example. Which language? Do you know any of French, German, Italian? Which one do you want? I hope it works. So this is. Yeah. It's not always noticeable, especially in English, I think. Yeah. Let's see if I can show you. But this is I don't know if there's many examples in here, but what I would do normally is I would try to find a parallel transcript. So we do with our courses, we give people audio, interactive transcript, flashcards, so we create some flashcard decks already. It's actually better if you make them yourself, but I know most people won't do it, so then it's still better, I think, to give it to them. Yeah, so what I would always do is just have a parallel transcript. You know, French here. Oh, what do I do? English here. And then normally, if the translation is good, of course, you will see the difference, or you will notice it. You'll think, because that's like the point of these parallel translations, right? Avec ce bouton, je préfère être en terrasse, on the terrace. I would, and près de la fenêtre. Okay, these are easy. I know this is not the examples that you're probably after, because this is not with the nuances, but the easiest way is with a parallel transcript, or with something like context.reverso. I really love that website, because you add a chunk, just a word combination, it gives you, like, not for everything, but for often like hundreds of example sentences with a translation in English or in another language. And then you often see, like, okay, so in this sentence it's used like this, and it means this, and in this sentence it's used differently. So,
I want to see, or like translate to any other language.
right. What was it I had to look up? Pissed off. On or off? These examples may contain rude words based on your search, guys. Énervé, that's a bit. Yeah, so this is an amazing, many of you are probably using it already, but this is an amazing website, right? You see, you write pissed off, it gives you all this, it gives you 653 examples with this, 128 with this. You click on the one you want to know more about, and it gives you only these. J'étais en colère. Papa, je sais que tu es en colère, mais je suis venu... Perfect. Te filer un coup de main. Another one here that you can start using. Papa a passé sa vie, spent his whole life. How do you say spend his whole life? Passé sa vie. You see, you do this and you immediately find more chunks already. So yeah, is this what you wanted to see? Good. I think we should... yeah. Thank you so much, guys. I hope you found it interesting. And if you have any more questions... yeah, by the way, you can download these case studies. You can download the case studies for French, German, Spanish, and Italian. So full dialogue with audio, with a transcript, with parallel translation. Flashcard deck as well, so you can see how I make the flashcards. On the website, go to thepolyglotlive.com/langfest. Yeah, I told you before, I've written a book on this method with a bit more explanation than what I did today. It will be published in the next 2 weeks. If you want to know more, if you're interested in that book, you can go to polyglotlive.com/book-langfest, and yeah, you'll be notified once the book is published. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
So thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I think everybody enjoyed it very much.